So for your first Photoshop assignment is you're going to be trying to recreate the effects of digital glitching, uh, but doing it in Photoshop instead of randomly modifying the code or trying to do it on the website. So the first thing you're going to do is find a photo. And so the idea here is that you're taking the same photo that you used for your digital glitch project, and you're going to create a new glitched photo here. Just one. You're not going to do the triptych. You just have to do this one time here. So here's my photo. It's called just basket of mushrooms. It's on my desktop. And if you have a Photoshop open and down here on your dock, especially if you're on a Mac, you could just drag that thumbnail and drop it right there. It's going to open it in Photoshop. However, if that's not the case, you need to right click on your photo, or if you're using a laptop, if you don't have a mouse, you're going to have to control click. And basically what that's going to do is give you the pop-up box here, and we can open with Photoshop. That should be one of the choices. If you don't see Photoshop, just go to Other, and you should see it there. Same thing if you're on a PC. Right-click on it, open with, and Photoshop should be one of the options there. I already have Photoshop open, so technically this should happen fairly quickly. I don't know why it didn't bring up the screen here. Oh, let me click down on here. It's taken a second for whatever reason. I just installed Photoshop. This is the first thing I'm doing, so maybe that's taking some time. But basically, again, right-clicking, open with, and choosing Photoshop should get this thing going here. There we go. So we're gonna get more into the getting more into Photoshop here as the semester goes on. But basically, if you're not familiar with Photoshop, all of your tools are along the left here. So these are just different tools that we can use to manipulate our image and to do other things. They all will pop up with a little box that explains what happens. Like if I mouse over the rectangular marquee, a little video plays and says exactly what it does. It makes a selection in the shape of a rectangle, for instance. Some of these have a drop-down menu. So if I actually click and hold my mouse for a second, on the rectangular marquee, there is an elliptical marquee, which basically will give you a round or elliptical selection, or rows, where you can kind of select individual rows of pixels. So a lot of these tools have similar tools built in underneath of them. Otherwise, this toolbar would just be way too large if it had every single tool possible showing at the same time. So if you go through here again and click on some of these and hold your mouse button down for a second, you'll see that there are tools under there that you can choose. Up at the top here, we have our main menu bar, I guess you could say. So there are all these different drop-down menus, from File, where we can create a new file, we can open a file, we can save as other types of files. We have Edit, where we can undo and redo things once we actually have something to undo and redo. There are quite a few other things that we're going to be looking at here as well. We have an image menu that is going to allow us to do different adjustments and whatnot, and then a bunch of others here that we'll get to, some of which we'll get to. Lastly, the important thing here are your layers down in the bottom right. So layers are basically really what makes Photoshop shine and what makes it so easy to use, easy to manipulate, and also easy to redo things if we don't like it. We always start off with one layer called our background. It is just it's like the initial layer in the image that we opened. So we opened if we open a JPEG or a photo, that is what's going to be on the background layer. If we create a brand new Photoshop file by going to File, New, we're going to just have a white background, just like a blank canvas that we can then build our image on. So the idea here is that you do some things that are just going to modify your image. So for instance, let me take the rectangular marquee and I'm just clicking and dragging over a selection, over a chunk of my photograph here, right? So this image now has marching ants around it, or this part of the image has marching ants in the shape of this rectangle. Photoshop now is only going to be concerned with things that are inside of that box, inside of those marching ants. Anything that I do is only going to affect those particular pixels. For instance, check this out. We can go up to Image, and let's go into Adjustments just to see what some of the things are. So here we can adjust things like the brightness and the contrast, the hue and saturation, the color balance. We could invert it, which is basically going to make it look like a negative, like a film negative. We can desaturate. It's going to totally take the color out. We can do some other things here, but what if we just go to hue and saturation? Well, that brings up a box. I'm moving it off to the side so I can see my image here change. But if I change the hue, it changes the hue of our image back here. So here we can make it, more green, more purple, basically just going along this slider here. We can also change the saturation, so we can really up the saturation, or we could completely desaturate it, or we can slightly desaturate it, I guess, or we can move it all the way to the left to have grayscale. The thing about when you're doing this is you're just seeing a preview of what will happen if you hit OK. So if you don't like what's going on, you could just hit cancel. You're right back to your image. It has not been modified. But here's the thing. If I were to have clicked OK, and if I were to have made that chunk of that block of that image purple or whatever the color was, that would sort of permanently alter our background image. That's considered to be a destructive force in Photoshop, or a destructive tool, I guess you could say, or process. Destructive means you are permanently changing those pixels. And therefore, yes, you could undo it. I could go to Edit Undo to get rid of that change I made. But if we were to save this and open it up later, we wouldn't be able to undo it then. We would kind of have permanently altered our image. So here's what we're going to do instead. To make this something that we could basically edit later and make it sort of so it's less destructive, instead of actually making a selection and then changing, going to the image and saturation and all that right then, we're first going to copy and paste. So I have this selection made with my marquee. I'm going to use Command-C. If you're on a PC, you'll use Control-C. You could also go up to Edit, Copy, and then you could go up to Edit, Paste. But getting used to these keyboard shortcuts is really going to help throughout this class and throughout every other time you use the computer. Command-C or Control-C on a PC will copy anything on any computer ever. Doesn't matter if it's on the internet, Photoshop, in an email, later on in Premiere Pro or Illustrator. It all works the same. It's the same shortcut. So I'm going to hit Command-C. That has copied that. Now I'm going to hit Command-V or Edit Paste. And what you notice right away is that the image does not change. The image looks exactly the same, except for the marching ants went away. But down here in the Layers palette is now a new layer called Layer 1. That is the chunk of information that I just copied and pasted. And actually, if I hide my background layer by turning off the little eyeball section, the little eyeball icon, you can see that now we have this layer that's kind of floating there, and it's really kind of on its own. This gray and white checkerboard pattern you see behind here, that is just Photoshop's way of letting you know that there's transparency there. There's really no image. This isn't white. This entire layer is only the shape and the size of the area that I have selected and pasted. So I can turn that back on, and again, it's there. How do we know it's there? Well, again, we know it's there. We can see it in the thumbnail that there is something there, and also if we turn the background layer off, we can see that there's nothing. That the layer is floating there. The one thing is, the first thing I'm going to do is rename the layer. Every Photoshop file that you turn in needs to have layers named something. You can't just leave them named layer 1 or layer 2 or layer 3 or whatever it is. That's going to get very confusing throughout this class, especially when you have some files that might have dozens of layers. So I would just name them what you think you want to name it. You can change it at any other point. I'm just going to name this horizontal chunk. Whatever makes sense to me right now. Now, I can change the color of that layer doing exactly what I showed you before, but it's not going to affect the background layer below it. The thing I have to make sure is that I have to have that layer selected. Which layer do we want to change the color? It's not the background. We want to change the color of this layer here. So I'm going to click on that first. Now if I go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and let's say I turn this thing green or deep blue like I might have had it before. And if I click OK, the idea here is that our image looks exactly the same as it would have looked before. But now, if I absolutely don't like this layer later on, it could be 2 weeks from now when I open this file back up, all I have to do is hide that layer. Boom. You just click on the little visibility icon, the little eyeball, that layer disappears. It's still there. We can turn it back on if we want to. We can delete it if we want. We could drag this layer down to the little Photoshop trash, or we can option or control click on that image, on that layer, and we can delete it and do other things here. But we don't have to. We could just turn it off if we don't like it. I accidentally zoomed in here. Real quickly, the hand icon or the hand tool near the bottom of your layers palette, if you're ever zoomed in or zoomed out and you need to get back to full screen, double click on the hand layer and it will basically make your image appear full screen, or as full as your screen can get. Now here's another thing. With this layer selected, because it's on its own layer, it's its own thing, I can actually get what's called the Move tool. The Move tool is the very top tool, and it allows you to click and drag layers around. So because that layer is now independent from the background, it can be moved anywhere. It can even be moved where it goes off the canvas or off the image. This entire thing inside of Photoshop is called a canvas, and you can't see things that are going outside of it. The rest of that layer is still there. I can move it over and see the rest of it later, but it's just not visible, now, I guess. So we can kind of move this layer around. We can do other things to it. We can also lower the opacity of this layer. So every layer down here has an opacity meter that we can click on down in our layers palette so that we can start to see through. And, you know, like offsetting things like this a little bit starts to look very interesting. It starts to get a little surreal, a little weird, might look a little bit like a 3D, like an old-fashioned 3D photograph, or something like that. But you can really start to do some interesting things by blending these layers together. Or blending layers, I guess, by changing the opacity. Here's the thing now, if I wanted to do this again and grab another chunk of the background, I have to make sure that I have the background layer selected. If I use my rectangular marquee and mouse over an area while having this layer selected still, that's what Photoshop is going to think I want to modify. So I'm going to make sure the background layer is selected. Maybe now I'll grab a a vertical chunk. Whoa, scrolled down a little bit too much there. Scroll back up. So now I've grabbed a vertical chunk of my image. Let me copy and paste that. It shows up as a new layer here that I'm just going to call a vertical chunk. Hit return. Oops. Really, I could rename that if I wanted to. And again, now that layer, if I grab my move tool, can be moved around independently from the rest of the image. I could come up to image and adjustments. What if I go to color balance this time instead of hue and saturation? Hue and saturation had one slider that could change the color. Here, color balance gives you 3 different sliders, while also allowing you to choose which tone you want to affect more. Do you want to affect the shadows? Basically, if you have shadows checked or selected, most of the color changes that you do by using these sliders are going to affect the darker colors. The highlights are going to affect the lightest colors, and the midtones are going to affect the ones in between. So you can kind of play around with that. So here I can move to the red, and then what if I move to the blue? I'm going to get a little more of a sort of a purple. I could move to green or magenta. I could do that to the midtones. Then I could come back and do the shadows separately. I could make the shadows a darker blue. Just like before, I could hit cancel or OK, but let's pretend I like this. Click OK, and now that is sort of permanently altered. Now again, this new layer we have destroyed. It's a destructive thing. I don't want to say it's destroyed, but it's destructive. Those pixels are permanently changed. Yes, I could hit edit and undo, but if I open this up later, if I close the file down and open it up later, I won't be able to undo that. I will, however, be able to turn these layers off and get back to the way it originally looked without really having to do anything different. So let me turn the opacity of this layer back up to the way it was so you can kind of see what's happening here. If I click and move this layer, it's moving this layer on top of all the other layers. The reason this layer, this blue horizontal chunk is obscuring the rest of the image is because it's on top of the layers palette. Background is on the bottom, this vertical chunk is on top of that, and the horizontal chunk layer is on top of that. If I move the horizontal layer, I'm just clicking and dragging it underneath the vertical layer, well, now it's below it. So now when I move it, it's kind of behind that layer. This becomes kind of important. The order of your layers becomes kind of important here at some point, especially when you get a lot of layers, just because you have to pay attention to what's on top of what. And if you're doing something over here and you're not seeing the correct changes, it could be that your layers need to be readjusted. So again, this is just as a super crash course, really, really simple tutorial in Photoshop. It's going to be enough to get you through this project. The main thing here is that you just play around with it. You do some interesting things to your image. Take different areas of your image, do different things to them, make a bunch of different chunks, make it as as crazy as you want, as surreal as you want, or whatever. It doesn't matter how you want to approach this, but just make an image that you think is, fairly interesting and still has that sort of digital glitchy feel to it. Which I think this kind of does, because we saw not necessarily this exact thing happen, but we saw in some of the digital glitch projects that we have some images, some chunks of the image can get moved around. Sometimes things just changed or got really drastically colored differently. The main thing here is that when you are done, you actually save this as a file that's going to be something that's going the correct file name. So for this, once you're done here, you're going to want to save this as a Photoshop file. So if we go to File, Save As, I'm going to click Don't Show this again, but I want to save it to my computer. I don't necessarily want to save it to cloud. That doesn't really... I'm working on a home computer. There's sort of no reason to save it to the cloud right now. So I'm going to save it to my computer, and then it's going to have a, the normal pop-up that's going to ask me, where do you want to save it? So here, we should name this our last name underscore glitch. And I know we already have something called, your last name underscore glitch, but that's a PDF. This will not overwrite that file. It won't, you really shouldn't be confused, because PSD stands for Photoshop document, and it's its own thing. The whole idea of Photoshop documents is that they're going to save your layers. So when we open this thing up later, everything's going to look exactly the way we left it. All of our layers are going to be there and everything. If you were to save it as a JPEG or something like that, Photoshop's going to say, hey, there's a warning here. You will not get your layers if you save it as a JPEG. That's fine for putting it on, social media or something like that. Something that, where people aren't going to have Photoshop to, to open it, but not for this class. We want this to always be a Photoshop document. I want to see your layers. I want to see how you built this image and how, how you put it together. And I want to make sure that you named your layers correctly, because that's going to be part of your grade. So you're basically just going to save it as your last name underscore glitch PSD. You don't ever have to type in manually the PSD or anything here. All you have to do is make sure that it says Photoshop format here. That's all you need. We're going to save it. This is going to pop up unless you click Don't Show Again, which I 100% suggest. But maximize compatibility is basically saying that they're going to put a little bit of extra information in this file so that older versions of Photoshop would be more likely to open this file correctly. Not a huge issue when you're going to be using your own computer the whole time, but let's say you save a document that you want to work on at school or somewhere else. You always want to make sure that you're maximizing the compatibility. It makes your file size slightly larger, but it's far worth it. Again, I just click Don't Show Again and OK, and you'll never get this popping up again. There's no reason to have to do this every time. Now, if I were to go to my desktop, here is my original JPEG, and now here is my glitched file that could now get uploaded directly to the blog. So again, very, very, very crash course, right? Like this is not an extensive tutorial by any means, but a very a quick way of starting to manipulate your image very quickly, which is what we just kind of want to do. Just jump in and mess around with it. If you absolutely screw it up so much that you're just like, I don't even know what's going on, and you want to completely start from scratch, what you can do is do File, Revert. Well, I've already saved this, so it's actually not going to let me do that. But if it's before you have like really saved it, Revert is going to allow you to revert the image back to the way it was when you opened it. Otherwise you could do Edit and Undo. as many times as you need to get back to the beginning. That's it.